Half a meal before I get.
But he's going to be a few. So welcome everyone, and this is session 3 of the municipal solar mapping project, and it's really a pilot project that we hope many municipalities will ultimately benefit by. So I want to thank everyone for being part of this first fall 2021 cohort. And I wanted to start by asking if there are any questions or comments from either session 1, but primarily session 2, where we reviewed sound land use planning and started to look at the layers for actually developing a solar map that can also be used for other renewables and storage as a very important part of municipalities understanding sound planning to make that transition to a renewable energy economy, which is so urgent. So any questions or comments that came up as you were reviewing? Penny.
I think this is probably, I'm going to assume that the limited functionality of the tool, the mapping tool that I've been playing with is limited because we haven't gotten to the end. And it then becomes fully functional. Is that correct? Oh, good. Okay.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, then I have one other question, and I think that it came from session 2, but it may have come from my frustrated trying to make things work. You talked about the red and the pink lines that I think determined where there were distribution areas, but I'm not entirely sure that I remember correctly, but I tried clicking on them and they didn't do anything. And maybe that's because of my first comment.
Yeah, so, and we'll get into this, actually, we're gonna cover this later, but the lighter or softer colored pink lines are too small. They're actually phase 1 lines, and they're not rated for hosting capacities. The hot pink lines represent transmission lines, and they I believe do have pop-ups enabled. But I'll try to hit that again when we get to those sections, and if I skip over that, feel free to remind me.
I actually did have one other comment. I kept running into Con Ed instead of Central Hudson, and I wasn't sure whether that was a mistake or whether it is Con Ed has greater influence than I knew.
Right, so in part 3, when you're looking at the hosting capacity maps, the map is actually displaying all of the utilities hosting capacities at once. And Con Ed, I believe, is listed at the top because it starts with C. No, that's, well, at any rate, Con Ed is at the top. I suppose Central Hudson would be first alphabetically, but if you had scrolled down in the legends, you would have seen Central Hudson. However, all of the utilities in the state have agreed to the same color scheme for hosting capacity. So if you're looking at the Con Ed colors in the legend, they're the same as the Central Hudson colors or the Orange and Rockland colors or the National Grid colors.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Any other questions or comments? how is it going for folks? This is a good time to jump in and share your experience.
How's it going in regards to?
Uh,
How about,
usability.
I'll just ask, oh, sorry, go ahead, Manager.
I was going to say usability questions that have arisen, and just comments that people want to share before we actually do a little bit of reviewing of the layers and then move forward.
Well, I guess if I could jump in, one question I had was, how are we seeing, what are the methods by which we have obligatory usage of this solar mapping analysis that we're looking at, that Scenic Hudson has done quite an impressive job with? But my question is, why do we think any of the municipalities are going to use it?
Well, for one thing, there's been a really good turnout for this pilot project. Jim Creighton wasn't able to be on tonight, but they've been kind of struggling to do this on their own. It is an excellent tool, but there seemed to be some value in sharing questions and information and experience. And it's up to each municipality how far they take it, but understanding basics that Alex has gone over so clearly in the layers we've looked at so far, and principles of land use planning, I think, are extremely valuable so that the communities can make wise decisions. But
I mean, can I just say that personally, I've seen these communities put a lot of money into open space inventory, open space planning, and we've got a lot of good ideas. And we actually see municipalities not actually availing themselves of that good data set that has been so well put together. And so I just have a question about it, because I see it as something that we need to rally around, actually making it legally binding to do planning like this, because the reality is we already see evidence in our region that this type of planning is not guiding the placement of the arrays that have already gone in. We have a bunch of arrays where we didn't look at mines, we didn't look at brownfields, we didn't look at Superfund sites, and they ended up plopped and dropped on Unadilla silt loam and not on places where they should go. So what's the legal clout behind which we can actually get planning communities to abide by these great tools, I think is another thing we need to be thinking about. Is it a zoning law? Is it a conservation easement? What are the means by which we can begin to actually have it be something that is binding, isn't just by good suggestion? I mean, how many of us have been on ECCs that are just ignored patently by the town building department, right? Constantly happens. The ECCs are toothless. They're an advisory committee. That's why I stopped going to them, because they constantly ignore you.
Andrew, Carol had her hand up.
Oh, no, I was just responding to toothless ECCs, such as the one I was on.
Okay.
I wish it was otherwise.
I think that there are a lot of ways to approach this legally binding, but the first two sessions we did talk about the documents that we each want to be looking at and making recommendations, for example, zoning changes or updating a comprehensive plan to include climate change and the value of understanding land use for renewables moving forward. I also think that this raises a good point about some of us are working on a regional energy working group, and we're making suggestions to the Public Service Commission and NYSERDA, and funding to go through this process might also, that'd be a positive incentive. And then after, soon after that, hopefully municipalities will modify zoning planning documents in favor of sound solar planning. Any other?
Thank you.
Great. Any other comments?
I have a comment about that, and I don't know what I missed them. I apologize, I'm late. I got stuck behind a train, among other things. But what about a model law? I know that, for instance, Gardner used a model law to work on their solar laws, only they used the wrong law. I mean, they didn't have a law that has the good things that we're trying to do here. So if we created our own and then we distribute it, that could be very helpful.
Absolutely. And I would be very glad to host a follow-up for communities that want to go in that direction and look at drill down and look at existing laws and see what what they can do to move that forward. Okay, we do have a lot of material to cover. I just want to be sure that everyone, feels comfortable moving forward and doesn't have something stuck that they wanted, to get clarified. Alex or anyone else?
Can we just touch base on attendance? There's a number here. I don't know who is joined. Who is 914-806?
That's me, Jim Creighton,
Oh, okay.
from Town of Cortland.
Gotcha.
Great.
Sorry, I couldn't get my video. I have another meeting that's just monitoring in the background, so sorry about that.
That's okay. And Chris is Chris Phone, I'm guessing.
That's
Yeah.
me. I'm here.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect. Thank you.
All right, I think with that, Alex, you want to take us, kind of bring us up to speed and take us forward?
Yes, thank you. I would just add per the last few comments that in addition to the solar mapping tool, we've come up with some other guides. We have a guide to help with solar zoning and a guide to help with solar siting issues. So while those are also informational tools and not obligatory, that hopefully would help, if towns have the motivation to work on laws, zoning and coding changes, that sorts of things. We do have those resources available. And just out of curiosity, if folks could just raise their hands to the camera, have you had time to play around in the solar mapping tool yet? Have you checked out part 3 on your own? I know a lot of people are busy, but okay, got a few hands up. That's great, thanks. Okay, I'm gonna start screen sharing here. And I'll also mention, we're going to try to cover the rest of part 3 tonight and then get into at least introduce part 4, which is where you really have all the power to use all of the different bells and whistles and data layers in the tool yourself. And, we're hoping that after tonight's session, starting with the next session, the format is going to be less me lecturing and more you all interacting, trading ideas, checking out your own communities and sort of grappling with some of these issues of the land use planning and then, motivating your communities to get on board. So I'm starting at the top of part 3 here, just for a little refresher. So part 3 again is learn about the layers. This is going through each layer individually, one by one. So you only see one layer at a time and explaining what that layer is and how it relates to solar and solar development. And again, part 3 is structured on these 4 steps of smart solar planning. And in case you didn't remember them, here they are here. We have a quick help here where you can get a refresher on them. So we already looked at assessing land use patterns. That was using the land cover map. We looked at finding opportunities. That was the mines, the rooftops, et cetera. And we were in the middle of looking at valued resources and where those are. So we're gonna skip back to that in just a moment here. And then just as a reminder, we do have this worksheet for folks to take notes on things as they're going through part 3 of different things that they notice about either, that they learn about the layer or that they notice about their town, oh, I didn't realize that there was a mine over there. Let me make a note of that and, I'll go back and check it out later. I'll also remind folks about these little section bookmarks here as I hover over. I can skip down to where we were last time. And you'll see this little 15 at the end. There are more than 15 dots, so you could skip down to the lower sections by clicking on that 15, back to the top 15 by clicking the one at the top there. So we left off with flood zone, floodplains, and wetlands, and I'm going to zoom back into our example community, the town of Wallkill, outside of Middletown. You can see the data is loading in here. And now we're going to go to protecting biodiversity and habitat. And we have just two layers in the tool here to represent what is a very, very wide field. Once again, we were trying to pick the single best layer to represent resources. And there are so many more resources out there. I'm a wildlife ecologist, and I could look at maps all day of different maps of forest layers, of wildlife and habitat layers. But we tried to really condense things down. And so what we're seeing here is important areas for biodiversity. And this is actually a conglomeration of different types of important areas for either individual rare, threatened, or endangered species, or else important habitats. And these are, this data layer is put together by the New York Natural Heritage Program, which studies biodiversity in the state. And it was done in collaboration with the Hudson River Estuary Program, which is an arm of DEC and Cornell University. And so they took known occurrences of these species or these habitats, and they created habitat models to kind of block off areas that they think are important for these animals and these habitats to persist. And so, for instance, I can click on one of these blobby things, and this tells me that this is an important area for natural communities. Or I can click on another one of these, and it'll tell me this is an important area for a terrestrial animal. And it has the size here. And these are quite vague. And the reason, one reason for that is because there are actually poaching problems with some of these species. And so it's really a risk to the individual animals or plants to reveal their exact locations or to reveal exactly which terrestrial species it is. For instance, if it's a rare orchid, people will go looking for it and then try to sell it on black orchid markets, if you can believe that. So that's part of the vagueness. The other thing is, as I said, we've condensed many layers down into one. But you tend to see blobs and you tend to see squiggly fingers. And if you might guess, and we're getting this is a whole big complex of an important natural community. But often these squiggly fingers are streams or rivers. That's why they're shaped like that. And they're either going to highlight an aquatic animal, a migratory fish route, something like that. And by and large, these are areas where we're going to want to be really careful and generally avoid solar development, except in a few very rare instances. These are some of the best areas for habitat and for biodiversity in the Hudson Valley. So we really want to try to be mindful of that. If you wanted to delve into more info on this, there is something called the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, which is again created by the Hudson River Estuary Program. And this is an amazing tool for something like a natural resource inventory and that type of thing. It is another interactive mapper, and it has layers upon layers of different wetlands. And so you'll see under biodiversity, we have them broken out here by your aquatic, terrestrial animals, your rare plants, important areas for migratory fish, et cetera. So this is a great tool if you love looking at maps like I do, or if you want to learn more about natural resources. A difference between this tool and the solar mapping tool, for one thing, it's layers turned on and off. And if you click on the eye, you get maybe a paragraph or a couple sentences about what the layer is. So it's a lot of spatial information, but not a lot of background necessarily on these layers. And the other thing, of course, is that it encompasses many, many layers, some of which have nothing to do with solar. So we've tried to pick the very best layers out of the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper to bring in to the solar mapping tool. And so one of those is these important areas for biodiversity. And if folks have questions as I move along here, please feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt. We're going to go to our next resource category here, which is core and important forests. I imagine a lot of you are well aware of the benefits that forests play, but we do have an info dive if you need help convincing others in your community. In addition to sequestering carbon and storing carbon, which mitigates climate change, they're also really important for biodiversity. They improve water quality, they filter rainfall, they provide shade and cooling in the summer. There are obvious recreational benefits for people in forests. And so obviously they're a great thing to have on the landscape, and we want to protect them as much as possible. A sort of a tenet of forest ecology is that larger forest blocks or cores tend to be better habitat for biodiversity. In the Hudson Valley, we have lots of forest health issues, including deer overpopulation. The deer eat the forest too aggressively and don't allow new trees to grow. We also have lots of invasive species. We have pests and pathogens, so diseases like the elm blight and the chestnut blight. Now we have emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid. So there are lots of threats to forests in our area. And so we want to protect them as much as possible and avoid clearing them as much as possible. And so the map we have here is showing our forest cores and edges. And if I click on a core, I'm going to get its acreage and then a little sort of quick reminder about what a core is versus an edge. And we also have an info dive that explains the core and edge concept a little bit better and how it might be impacted by solar. So here again, you see sort of a representation of cores and edges. And what these edges are really the distance from, or the distance from cleared area. So if you imagine this yellow area here as either a developed area, buildings, parking lots, roads, agricultural fields, any sort of cover or habitat type that's not forest, that can negatively impact forest species. There are some species that are very sensitive to these edges, and so they're really not going to go within a certain distance of an edge. So for some songbirds, for instance, studies have shown that they're not going to come within 100 yards of a farm field or a road or anything like that. They're going to stay in the core of the forest and stay away from the edge of the forest. And so if you plop down pardon my scrolling here, and there's obviously, this is more detail about what I've just explained, but if you plop down a solar panel, even if you're only clearing a little bit of forest, and even if it's only in the edge, you're pushing the edge deeper into the core, and you can be breaking up core blocks. And so even clearing on the edge of a forest can really negatively impact the core depending on your setting, on your location. So for instance, this solar panel here is eating into these two cores. It's splitting one big core into two smaller cores. And it's going to impact the forest dependent species that are there. However, you've got a road here and a little bit of edge here. If you build some solar here, it's not going to impact the closest core. So all forests have a lot of different benefits, as I mentioned, but there is a balance. Generally speaking, if you are just talking about carbon, building solar is going to be a better climate change mitigator. However, forests also add all of these other benefits. So you really have to think about, the forests in your community, what role they're serving, et cetera. And so if I go back now to our map, we can start to look at our example town of Wallkill here that's highlighted. And we can look at where our forest cores are. So here in Highland Lake State Park, obviously we have really big forest cores. Those are going to be really ecologically valuable. Down here near Middletown, we have a little spit of forest edge. This is not going to be providing nearly as much of the habitat quality for forest interior species as the big cores up here. But this may be a park that is the closest park to folks that live in Middletown or folks that live in Wallkill and these neighborhoods here. So while, you know, the cores should really be sacrosanct, and there are times when clearing a little bit of an edge might make sense. It might come out on top in terms of carbon balance. You want to think really critically about all of the different values that forests are providing. You know, this edge forest may also be, for instance, filtering water, providing shade during heat waves, et cetera. And so it really comes down to your community, how much forest you have, what types of forest you have. There are towns in the Catskills that are, you know, wall-to-wall forest core. And if they want to site solar, they're going to have to think about where they want that solar to go. It's going to take just a minute to load in here. There are other towns like town of Poughkeepsie or some of the cities in the Hudson Valley that have almost no forests. And in those cases, you know, every little fragment of forest is going to be extremely valuable. So it's again, it's a value judgment, and it's weighing the benefits of forests, the benefits of solar. But again, if we go back to our 4 steps of smart solar planning, if we optimize our opportunities, those win-win locations, the old mines, the rooftops, the parking lots, hopefully, you know, there's plenty of room for solar without having to get into forest edges, let alone forest cores. Questions so far on any of the either of the 2 biodiversity layers?
I have kind of a general question.
Please.
I wonder, and you may have already talked about this, but I wonder, is there, when we think about siting solar, I wonder, is there a context of an energy budget per se, where we could start to say, well, we know that Burlington, Vermont is 100% renewable already, and they've got something like, I want to say it's 32,000 people in Burlington. And Poughkeepsie is something like 24, somewhere in that neighborhood. Then could we do an energy budget where we begin to say, all right, if we want to power the town of Wallkill within the drainage basin of the Wallkill, how much acreage and where would it be necessary to site solar to power the town of Wallkill? Or is what we're talking about a grid tied model that isn't necessarily about constraints that are based on an energy budget that has to do with consumption levels of the immediate population?
Go ahead, Manager.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I've been working with Samrat from New Paltz, who's a high school teacher, to do that research. Essentially, for us to be able to understand the load that our municipality, you know, the demand, the use of electricity within a given boundary. And we've been talking about this offline, in particular, to see how each municipality would need to move forward to try to address the 70% by 2030 renewable energy goal and the concurrent emissions reductions. So I think that understanding that, not that every single municipality is going to reach a 70%, and some municipalities may be able to exceed 70% by 2030. But it's a really good question, and internally we've been having that discussion and doing that research, and we're hoping to be able to find a way. The municipalities that have done greenhouse gas inventories will have that information for the municipal buildings, because they get those bills directly and they can fairly easily do those calculations. But to understand for the entire geographic region of a municipality, we're trying to see, reaching out to the New York Independent System Operators Public Service Commission, the utilities, trying to see where we could get that information. And I think there are also ways of estimating it. So a very good question, and let's make a note of that to follow up in the 4th or 5th session, see what we found out.
Yeah, thank you. I have more to share about that when it's appropriate. We can.
Great.
I've got a question, Alex. So I was able to kind of start looking, or using the tool to look at the town of Phillipstown, and and I know how the first step in the process, very smartly, is looking at opportunities in large roofs or old mines or Superfund sites, and so that's a very useful process. It gets a bit overwhelming when you start going through all the other layers, and so what was crossing my mind was, I can imagine going through those layers after I've identified 2 or 3 high priority spots, based on either the town of Phillipstown owns those spots and we have control over them, versus, so I'm kind of, my mind is going to prioritizing the spots I kind of want to run through the layers. So I'm not kind of just like getting lost amongst the layers. And so, that's just a general point down the line of saying, it's great that there's a large rooftop, it's owned by a private business, we can spend time going to that private business and trying to bring them on board versus, lands that are owned either by the villages within the town or the town itself, and then using those to run through the layers to make sure that we're kind of doing due process on them. And I don't know if you have any guidance on that, or else I start to feel overwhelmed, like going through all the layers with all the sites,
Yeah, thank you. That's a great great comment. And both of those ideas are great, and I think it's important not to get overwhelmed, because you can easily get overwhelmed with all this information. When we get to part 4, we do have a few sort of examples of suggestions of 2 or 3 layers to turn on at once and maybe think about together. But Jason, I think both of the approaches you were mentioning, identifying those opportunities, zooming in on them, and then looking for other red flags, that can be a really productive way to go. Whether that's, municipal owned or, privately owned, that maybe a group or the community wants to approach them and see if they're amenable. The other thing that could be done, zooming out a little bit and looking again at your community as a whole, and trying to identify those least the best opportunities, but just sort of keep in mind that it doesn't have to be today. So if you're thinking about, for instance, revising zoning, there may be areas that check, that don't have any red flags, but don't check all the boxes yet for some reason, but that doesn't mean they won't down the road, if that makes sense. And so that's another kind of way to think about it. It is a bit broader.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So next up, we have preserving the integrity of historic, recreation, and protected sites. We have a couple different layers to represent this. And we also have a link here to our siting guide, and we are actually just tricking people to go from one tool straight to another. It's embedded here as an info dive. So if you want to look at our guide to siting renewables and some tips there, you can do it right in here. The other thing we have in here is a link to an example of a successful sort of experience that Scenic Hudson had with a historic landmark. And that links out actually to an article about it, the historic Bronson House. And so that is represented by the National Historic Register. These are the listings in New York State of National Historic Register listings. And we also have protected areas from the protected areas database of the US. And so they're both colored the same because they're a little bit similar. But if you click on them, it'll tell you whether it's a protected area or a historic site, and then it'll give you some more information about it. The historic register areas, I think, are fairly straightforward. Through here. The US Protected Areas Database is a compiled data set from public agencies, state, federal, and more local at times, as well as nonprofits like land trusts. It's not necessarily a complete data set. So this was the best data set that we could come up with when we were building the tool. But I would urge everybody to use local knowledge as well, because we have seen some holes here in these data sets. And really the intent for both of these is to kind of put a pin on the map for you. This is not to say you can't build solar near them, but merely to make sure that you're aware of as many of them as possible. And again, you want to bring your local knowledge to the table as well. And keep these places in mind as you're thinking about solar. And so going back to our example in Greenport, and I can actually, well, I won't zoom over there now, but the historic Bronson House is a house just south of the city of Hudson in the town of Greenport. It's a historic manor, and it has sort of wide sweeping views in some directions. And there's a solar company that wanted to build solar panels basically, next door or one property over. And the folks at the historic house were very concerned because of the scenic vistas were part of what made this site historic and remarkable. And so, Scenic Hudson sat down with both parties and basically did a little rearranging of the site and came to an agreement where they moved around a few solar panels and they were able to hide all of them from view from the historic house. And they were able to get that solar sited. The historic house maintained its historic integrity and legacy. And it was, another one of these win-wins that we keep striving for. And so again, when you see these polygons here, these shapes on the map, and you can click on them and get more info, it's not to say don't put solar anywhere near here, but it's to, ding a little bell in your head that says, I should figure out what this site is, think about what its importance is, and then think about, what we, is a public lookout or viewpoint important for this site, or is it, a small historic house in the middle of a city, and it doesn't really matter if there's a solar facility a quarter mile away. So I think we already talked in one of the earlier sessions about energy justice, but here is a reminder for folks to consider that as they're thinking about smart solar planning and thinking about all the different populations and community members in their community. And we link back to the same info dive that we linked to in part 2 as a reminder for folks. So that's the end of step 3, which is looking at valued resources and making sure we avoid negative impacts of solar. Any questions on that before I go on step 4, which is assessing solar development feasibility?
Alex, I have a question. Marbletown ran into that a similar problem with siting a solar farm in a historic district where there was strong opposition because of how it changed the view. In fact, it's in court right now. Does Scenic Hudson often help negotiate this? Is that something you folks do?
Audrey,
Alex is smiling. We have been participants and interveners, especially in some of the larger projects that have been proposed in Greene County. We're also sort of paying attention to the one that's happening in Columbia. Just sort of based on staff capacity and, whether or not we feel like the local folks are kind of handling things on their own. So for the most part, we generally don't, get involved unless it turns into sort of a really big issue. But we're always happy to sort of hear about the story and see if we can, point folks in the direction of some resources to help. It sounds like if this is already in litigation, it's a little bit beyond that point. You know, if it is something where there's an important visual resource or historic resource, and it looks like we can have some benefit, then sometimes we do. And this is actually no different. And it's something I just wanted to, you know, point out. This tool is particularly built with regard to solar development, right? But as we know, you know, there's development of many types happening. And so a lot of these resources that we are looking at, whether it's forest cores or wetlands or ag resources, you know, they're under development pressure from other kinds of development as well. So, you know, when we are thinking about things like where should we site solar and trying to find those win-win situations, you know, and the benefits of solar, and then its ability to help, you know, in terms of climate change, are all things to be considered. So yeah, hopefully you don't get yourselves into that litigation position, and you know, we do come in and try and do some help when there are issues like that.
All right, good to know.
Audrey, if I'm not mistaken, there are some helpful tips in both the citing and the zoning guide on how to use solar now to try to avoid litigation and write good code. Is that? She's nodding yes. So
yeah, I would also add, this has been very destructive to the community, turning neighbor against neighbor. So anything to avoid that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to, you know, like some of Andrew's questions, and you know, how do we figure out how do we get these things built, right? I mean, and that was the whole reason behind the tool. And you know, we didn't want to make a static map that tells people where things should go. And you know, we're also, you know, it sure would be nice if somebody said you always have to use Scenic Hudson's mapping tool, but you know, we're not going to be asking folks to make that mandatory, you know, because there are, you know, as Alan, you say, things get pretty emotional on the ground, you know. So hopefully, you know, through education and understanding and recognition, you know, people can move to a place where they recognize these as potentially beneficial installations. But I think, as you found, you know, sometimes you will find folks who are just against it, no matter what. And not too long ago, I was on a conference, and not the next phrase after NIMBYism, which we're all familiar with, right? Not in my backyard, is apparently bananaism, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So, you know, so hopefully through education and you know, understanding of the fact that we can come to, you know, through collaborative processes, some conclusions where projects like this can get built, like Alex just explained, we can start to meet our goals. And through folks like you. Thanks, Alan.
I see Manna Joe's hand is up, but I'll just sort of reiterate, you know, I always think of the purpose of this tool is to get people at a common starting point with information.
Yeah, I also want to, at this point, just stress the value of conflict resolution and mediation. I've had the privilege of facilitating some conflict resolution amongst people that were actually in court with each other, didn't want to be in the same room. If one of the opposite people came in, they would literally walk out. And we brought everyone together and asked them to, you know, set aside the history and start in the present and try to work together to create a solution. And I don't want to take the time to give the specific examples, but when you can do that, the solutions are far better than anything that would come out of a court decision. So I just want to, you know, offer, and particularly Alan in Marbletown, if I can be of any help. And there are organizations in every county that focus on conflict resolution and mediation. Without that, people just dig in, and the solutions are not as effective or wise. And I see Carol has her hand up.
Yeah, I was just curious, that example that you just gave us of the array being near the historic site. How big was that array? Either in acres or megawatts, or just curious, how small is it worth going? Because, you could have many of these spread around.
It wasn't a huge array. I think it was a megawatt or so.
No, I'm sorry. The question is more for Alex. He gave the example of one that worked.
Yes, I believe it was 5 megawatts, so that would be something like 25 acres or so.
So there was a previous question. I was kind of waiting to see if there were anybody going to raise this. I mean, these tools and the layers are really great for being able to visualize that. But I think I'm kind of like hoping, obviously it's subjective from location to location of what's a suitable location for solar, right? There's issues associated with zoning laws, building, yada, yada, yada. So we can go on forever. On the other hand, those that have had experience in using this tool and successfully, and that, is there any thought to, I hate to bring this term AI, right? But is there any thought to being able to look at all of the different layers that are associated with finding a suitable site and doing a weighted average to be able to zone in, right? I mean, just come in and just pre-define locations so that then the user can then go further and either eliminate them or say that they're worth considering. In other words, we're looking at diversity in habitat, we're looking at proximity to, three-phase, interconnection. We're looking at, size in terms of that. There's the use of the land, so it sounds to me like we have, we've got all the ingredients to make a nice stew, but we don't have a real cook that says, and maybe that's what we're trying to become, are the cooks. But I'm not quite sure that there isn't some way to automate that process a little bit more. I'm not asking for, well, I am asking for someone to be able to say, well, here's the ideal site for you in this particular location, and this would represent a 4 megawatt potential solution, and cost-wise, it would be this and that. I mean, those evaluations are all going to happen over time. But is there something already defined in a way that you look at a map, and maybe Alex, you can look at a map and I say, well, look at this geography, and where would you focus your efforts? It would be nice to have that automatically done, right?
Yeah, that's
big.
That's I really like that analogy that you used. I might have to steal that if you don't mind. That we gave you the ingredients and we're trying to make you the chefs. I'll point out
you got to give me credit though.
Fair enough.
And I did want to say to Amanda Joe, maybe you should offer your services to the Senate. Okay, all right.
So I'll tell a brief vignette about the town of Cazenovia, which is up towards Syracuse. And they have an organization called the Cazenovia Preservation Foundation, which is a land trust. They focus both on environmental conservation as well as historical resources. And they got a GIS intern from one of the colleges up there. And they took the solar mapping tool and a replication guide that we made for folks outside the Hudson Valley. And they took their local zoning maps and they took some other GIS data sets that they had for their town. And they went to the planning board. And they said, we want to map out the best places for solar and rank them in our town. input upfront ahead of the game. Let's work on this together. And they did exactly what you're talking about. And they came up with sort of scoring systems for what are the really important resources, where are the opportunities, where are places where, you know, the zoning is going to prohibit this, where are places where we might need to change zoning if there's no other reason that solar wouldn't be good here. So I think that's a really valuable approach. And the reason that we've handed everybody ingredients is because not everybody wants the same dish at the end of the day. Because Hudson Valley communities are so diverse in their resources and their priorities. You know, some places are much more urban and developed. Some places have a really strong agricultural and farming background and economy and want to conserve that. Some places are heavily forested. They're up in the Catskills. They rely on ecotourism. So, you know, to your point about couldn't we do this with AI? Technologically, yeah, probably, but you have to tell the computer what you value most. And I don't want to tell you all how to rank these resources. So that's the sticking point. But, and I won't put Jim on the spot too much, but I know that the town of Portland was also working on sort of a scoring rubric of comparing, you know, sort of ranking impact on one side and ranking opportunity on another side and trying to score different sites in their town and come out with sort of the best scoring places to put solar. The other kicker I'll add in here is, again, local knowledge and knowledge of ownership and status of parcels is so important. Because, you know, you may see, okay, there are farm fields, and I can tell you where there are farm soils or where there are agricultural districts with the solar mapping tool. What I can't tell you is whether there's a farmer who's about to retire with no kids that want to take on the farm, or whether there's a farmer who wants to lease their least productive land so that they can keep farming their most productive land and still stay afloat financially. So those are the types of things that I think you all can bring to the table with your communities that you're never going to capture that really fine scale local knowledge with an AI.
Could also, just to chime in on that, I think it also gets back to the conversation of an energy budget and setting a context, because to really do a thorough, comprehensive energy plan, we don't just want to be thinking about siting solar, you know, anaerobic digesters, solar thermal hot water, conserving and cutting down on the need for energy, full diet year-round food supply. Where's that going to come from? So I think to really go about this from a planning viewpoint, where we do start to get more comprehensive and integrated, let's think about a number of different initiatives where we can come up with a energy budget and what I like to call the right technology for the right place for the right use. Right? How do we discern that?
Okay.
It's a great.
Yeah, great discussion. And I look forward to more of this as we move past me briefing everybody on the tool and get into more of this the next few rounds here.
I was just going to jump in, Alex, and to answer Denise's question, I think that the developers have that kind of software. I think they have it for both rooftops and, you know, land forms to, you know, because I think that's their way of taking sort of a first blush, but that's why it's so important for the municipalities to take this up and do the kind of exercise and thinking that we're talking about here.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great comments and questions. The other thing I just remembered that I wanted to mention about this protected areas database of the US is that this was the best, as I said, best data set that we could get in 2019 when we were assembling all of this. The New York Natural Heritage Program and some other partners, Scenic Hudson included, are working on the New York protected areas database. And hopefully that will be coming out in the next year or so. It got slowed down by coronavirus, but when that does come out, it's going to be, I think, a much better and more complete data set for our area. And as soon as that's ready, we're going to swap this data out for that data. So stay tuned. So now we're into step 4 of the 4 steps of smart solar planning, which is the last one, looking at actual solar development feasibility. And the first layer we have here is a pretty large scale, coarse scale layer, I should say. So this is one you're probably going to want to look at it at the townwide level, kind of like your land cover map, as opposed to zooming in really close. This is what we call landforms affecting solar feasibility, and it really has to do with slope and aspect. And so, you know, briefly put, solar is best placed on flatter areas and is best placed on areas that face south, because here in the northern hemisphere, the sun is usually in the southern hemisphere, and you get shadows cast to the north more often. So you can see here, you know, if you try to put solar on the north side of a really big mountain, it's going to be in shade, or on the north side of tall trees, or on the north side of a tall building, etc. And so here we have in blue, we have our flattest places, basically level places. And then we have greens and yellows for places that are a little bit steeper, but still fairly south facing. And then we have the places that are the steepest or the most northerly, have the most northerly exposures that are going to be the least feasible. We did talk to solar developers when we were developing this layer and the tool as a whole, and we tried to kind of say, well, how steep is too steep? How north is too north? And we never really got a very good answer, other than if you have enough money, you can put solar almost anywhere. But the developers, of course, want their project to make economic sense. And so in the broad strokes, these blue areas are going to be the best places and the red areas are going to be the worst places. And again, as I said, if you zoom in really close, the layer goes away because it's not accurate enough to zoom in that far. But if you want to look at your town as a whole, think about zoning and land use planning, this can be a useful layer, because you'll see as we go, you know, into the Gunks, the Catskills, the Taconics, the Highlands, there are broad swaths of area that are really not suitable. So now we're getting into interconnection. And this is, you know, basically the power grid or the electrical grid. It's the infrastructure system that lets us all turn on a light when we want to. So it's composed of generation, which could be solar panels, windmills, nuclear generators, gas-fired power plants, coal-fired power plants, et cetera. It could be anything. We hope more of it will be responsibly sited solar generation. But this generation is utility scale. This is large power generating stations. They are sent through a substation into big transmission lines. These are the really big multi-tiered towers you see. They go back to a substation, and then they go into our distribution network and into our use, whether that use is commercial, commercial, residential, or industrial. And so Manna said she actually had a good way to remember this, and I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so she can share it all with us and hopefully wake us up a little bit.
Well, I got very confused about the grid until my mentor, Tom Kakandis, who is amongst other things a solar installer, used this tool to help us remember. So the first, and this is primarily a one-way grid, but it works with distributed energy in a two-way grid as well. And that's what we're transitioning to. So it starts with generation and then transmission over high voltage wires across the state sometimes, and then distribution to the homes and businesses, and then use. So generation, transmission, big heavy duty high voltage wires, distribution, and then use. So I don't know if people want to do that, but it'll help you to remember. Let's try it for anyone who wants to. Generation, transmission, distribution, use. I hope that's helpful. Just to remember, because it's easy to confuse transmission and distribution.
Thank you. I really like it. And it's certainly good to do something a little bit more active than staring at a screen for a minute.
I think to chime in on this part about the grid, if I may, for a quick minute, I know that independent system operators estimate that there's something like 11,000 miles of transmission lines in the northeastern corridor, and their estimate is that 4,000 of them are going to need to be replaced in the next 30 years to the tune of about $25 billion. And the ISO actually recommends that we create a decentralized distributed grid network of some sort. And I wonder, that seems like an important piece of the puzzle when we talk about the viability of a more regional plan for these renewables and how they're all gonna, make good design sense.
And if I may, I just want to say that that is a really critical thing that the Energy Working Group that I mentioned earlier will be in discussion with the Climate Action Council and, have very strong comments when they come out with their draft plan. There are already some mechanisms in place to relieve particularly the grid blockages, the bottlenecks. That's very important for long distance distribution. For example, wind from Western New York down to New York City. But I think where it's most relevant to this solar mapping project is it's hard to find good areas. And if we find good areas in a municipality, but there is not good grid interconnection, then we have to figure out how to make that happen, who's going to pay for it, how that cost will be fairly distributed. And the opposite is also true. There are places where there's really good grid interconnection, and we haven't been able to, for example, put storage facilities to replace closing fossil fuel facilities because there are obstacles to that. So there is a very active group here in the Hudson Valley that is paying attention to that. But lets us be able to define where the grid is helpful and where it could be helpful because there's good potential for generation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Onward.
Yeah, I'll just
Yeah,
say,
totally. Thank you.
I agree completely, Anna Jo, with what you just said. And this schematic is to help solar mapping tool users understand the lingo behind the layers you're about to see. But that's not to say that this schematic is how we should, how we want the world to be. I think there's a lot of room for improvement, but hopefully the takeaway here is just because we're about to look at transmission lines and distribution line layers in the map. This is just sort of a schematic to help folks understand the difference between those two.
Thank you.
Actually going to go ahead and scroll down here and we're going to get to hosting capacity. So hosting capacity deals with distribution lines. And if you need a refresher and Manna's technique doesn't work for you, you can click on the help link here and bring up this diagram again. And when we talk about distribution lines, it's these guys. It's the telephone, what I would have called a telephone pole up until recently. It does have telephone wires, but also distribution of electricity on it, right? So this is the stuff going from the substation to our houses, our places of work, et cetera. And this is going to be probably the most complex layer. So I hope you'll all bear with me on this. The concept is fairly simple. Hosting capacity is how much extra space there is to send more electricity through a given line. So if you think about it kind of like a pipe, how full of water or electricity is that pipe? Is there extra space left in that pipe? If we add a solar project and try to connect it to a given line, is that line going to be overloaded or not? That's the general idea. And we have an info dive here, and this is, again, the most technical one with the most math in it, so I'm sorry, but here we go. So again, we have these distribution lines, and the ISO was mentioned, the New York ISO, Independent Service Organization, I think. Basically, it's the body in New York State that makes sure that when you hit a light switch, the lights come on and it doesn't blow up and we don't have blackouts. They're responsible with the utilities for making sure that we have consistent power, and hosting capacity is part of that. And so the utilities in the state are actually legally required to provide these hosting capacity maps. And these show where there is room on the line, again, room on the line to add more solar without upgrading the lines. And so they show these with these color-coded lines. And these are called feeder lines, and they tend to go out from substations. And you can see here in the legend, the largest hosting capacities are in blue. The lowest hosting capacity is this brownish red, and then we have everything in the middle. And these are only for what are called three-phase distribution lines. There are also one-phase distribution lines and two-phase distribution lines. Those are smaller and they're not rated for hosting capacity. If you zoom into the map, you'll see those in that light pastelish kind of pink that I mentioned earlier. So we can zoom, actually I can zoom in right now. And we should see some of those pop up. Here's one here. So if I click on this, I have the pop-ups turned off. Anyway, these pink lines are the smaller phase 1 and 2 lines that we don't have hosting capacity for. The other colors we do have hosting capacity for. And so if I go back to my info dive here, it actually remembers where I was. So hosting capacity is based on basically the utilities all run a computer model, a computer program to estimate what it's going to be. And they do this once a year and they refresh it once a month.
Can I ask a very quick clarification question,
Yep.
Alex? So when we're looking at this map, when you're looking at a dark line, that 0.01 to 0.29, that's telling you the amount of extra capacity, estimated extra capacity in that line.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
More or less, but we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty here for a few minutes.
Okay.
So if you click on one of these hosting capacity lines, it'll bring up this pop-up. And just as a reminder here, there are sometimes multiple pop-ups. You saw me wrestling with this a minute ago. If I click here, there are multiple pop-ups, both for different segments of the line. And then if I go far enough, it'll tell me I've clicked on the town of Wallkill. So you use these arrows here to click back and forth through these pop-ups. Yeah, that is, I think, one of the trickier things about the map is remembering that these arrows are here. So if you, assuming you're looking at the right segment, which is going to be highlighted in this sort of really brightest highlight blue there, it'll bring up the hosting capacity information. And this is a sort of a series of numbers, and you kind of have to do a little bit of reading to really get into them. So these local numbers, the local maximum minimum, those are, and all these numbers are in megawatts, by the way, not kilowatts, megawatts. So 1 megawatt is about, of ground mount is about 5 acres. So fairly large numbers. For this little highlighted segment here, the local hosting capacity is somewhere between 3 and 4.9 megawatts. They also, and so these were the numbers when they last did their annual analysis. They've added 0.06 megawatts since that annual analysis. That's DG installed since the last hosting capacity analysis refresh. And what is DG? Distributed generation. So if I go back here, what the heck is distributed? Okay, so distribution lines, those are our telephone poles. Distributed generation are the types of things that Andrew's talking about. The non-centralized power stations, when we put solar on our roofs, or ground mount solar that's community solar, local, smaller generation. And it could be solar, it could be micro hydro, as is being done in some places in the valley. So that's all distributed generation. So going back to our info dive here, which is now rebooted. right? So distributed generation, DG, since last hosting capacity analysis refresh. And these acronyms are all in the text in this info dive. So fear not if you don't remember. There's DG, here's hosting capacity analysis. So this DG connected, that's the distributed generation, the solar that's already connected to this line, to this feeder line. That was accounted for in the last hosting capacity analysis, HCA. This is what they've added since then. So this number is going to affect our local hosting capacity. There's also DG in queue here. Distributed generation in queue. So what does in queue mean? It means that somebody has petitioned the utility to add that much power to the line. So if I want to figure out, and this is getting to your question, Jason, what if I wanted to add solar and not do line upgrades, how much space is there on this segment here? I'm going to look at the local maximum. I'm going to subtract the distributed generation added since the last time they did the analysis. And then I'm going to just subtract what's already in queue. Somebody's already gotten approval to add 1.26 megawatts. So the maximum solar that I'm going to fit on here without upgrades is going to be something like 3.5 megawatts. Now that was maximum. I could have done it with the minimum number instead. And there are lots of caveats and asterisks here, and this is all in the text, but in queue is somebody that's gotten approval to add that on, but it doesn't mean they did. So if their financing falls through, if they get sued by somebody, et cetera, that may or may not go through. And this also is all an estimate. It's based on a computer model. So this is going to give you a ballpark. If you get serious about building solar, you have to do an interconnection study for the specific site and the specific project you want to build. And you do that with the utility. Usually the solar developer pays the utility for this analysis. So again, these are all ballpark numbers, but it'll give you a sense as we zoom out of where there is more and less capacity to start adding to lines without upgrades. And that's another key caveat. You can always spend more money to build a bigger line. Whether that's going to be economically viable for a solar developer is another question. So we're here in Highland, and there's a substation here, and we can see there's a feeder that kind of goes out to the west. So if we go farther out from the substation, farther along the feeder, we're going to see the hosting capacity decrease. Whereas the last one was a max of 4.9. As we get farther out, it's decreasing. Now it's 1.6 megawatts, between 1.5 and 1.6 megawatts. Because it's on the same line, there's the same amount installed since the last refresh and the same amount in queue.
Hey, Alex, how do you identify a substation on the map?
So we actually, they're not mapped on our map, I'm sorry to say. We had trouble getting a complete data set to put into the solar mapping tool. Some of the utilities are more forthcoming with those locations and others are not. You can sort of surmise it because hosting capacity tends to be higher, closer to substations. So I can see here, there are going to be substations in Middletown. And as we get further out away from the city, there's less hosting capacity. So there are probably going to be substations in here. And if you click on, I believe if you click on a line segment, it will tell you which substation that feeder line goes to. So that can be helpful too. Some of them are very clearly named. The Highland substation is in Highland. Some of them are very cryptically named and it's very hard to tell where they are. The other thing I'll mention, sorry, is that?
No, great, thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. A couple things here, I think.
I have a quick question. I don't know if this is the right place, but when we do large centralized generation, it has to go to a transmission line and then a distribution line. But are you saying that some of the larger distribution lines can take distributed energy and then move it onto the larger grid? Does that make sense?
Yeah, the first answer to your question is yes, distribution lines can take, so for instance, the darkest blue lines will take up to 5 megawatts of solar power distributed. So that's a fairly large project. Whether
Yeah.
that power gets transmitted, gets converted to a substation and can be transmitted, I'm not sure about.
It can unless it's a network circuit, which can run bi-directional flow. Most of the circuits in the Central Hudson territory go from the substation downstream, so it's just one way.
Thank you, Melissa.
But I would say Central Hudson doing a lot of upgrades, and like they did this project in Westerlo, a big solar project, and they actually had to revoltage some of the substations. They actually in the territory have a substation that Thomas Edison built and designed, and it's still in use. And they slowly are redoing their substations and changing over the outdated voltages to take on this bigger capacity. But
I
Yeah.
remember when I installed my first solar system, the gentleman from Scenic Hudson said, essentially, we can accommodate this, but if everybody does it and the businesses do it, we're going to have to totally retrofit the grid. And that was a good 10 years ago. And that's what they're actively doing now. So that's a step in the right direction for sure.
Yeah. Thank you both for those comments. And this is a good reminder. Again, this is, this hosting capacity is current hosting capacity as of the last analysis without upgrades. And we're going to need to see a lot of upgrades. And so, zooming out even more to our 4 steps of smart solar planning, that's why this is step 4, because these lines can be upgraded. You can make a line carry more power, but you can't build a forest overnight. You can't replace farm soils.
How current is this data that you see through the tool?
Sorry?
How current is the data that we're looking at from in the tool? Is it
Yeah.
a week old? Is it a day old? Is it a month old?
Good question. So I'll zoom back into a little bit of the nitty gritty here and answer that along with a few other points I'll make. So first off, these lines are solid out here. As we get into Middletown, these are all dotted lines. Why is that? It's because the dotted lines are underground lines. And to Penny's question earlier, you can see because I have all of the utility territories showing, you can scroll through the legends for all of them. Only some of them have underground mapped. There we go. But the color coding is the same. So dash lines are underground, same colors, and the same colors across all of the utilities. They all got together and agreed on this color scheme. So zooming back into Denise's question, if you scroll down in your pop-up, you have the hosting capacity analysis refresh date. So the last time they did the major analysis was December of last year. And then the refresh date on what's in queue and what's been connected since this hosting capacity analysis. So, right, these numbers here were updated actually even longer ago. So you can scroll down and see, and you'll see different, here they've gosh, that seems like a really long time ago. I don't know if that data is actually accurate, but generally speaking, the refresh dates should be in these pop-ups and hopefully are accurate. So I wanted to just take a minute, take a breath, go back to our numbers and our math here. Is this, again, this is the most math you'll see in the tool, I promise. Is everybody okay with this? It's a little overwhelming. It takes a few times for me even to, I was reviewing it again before, just before our session, because I had to sort of refresh myself on this stuff. But if I can try to answer any questions on any of this stuff, I'm happy to now. Stunned silence.
I've got one question, which I know this is all kind of rough estimates, you've been, but so as we're doing this and I'm looking in town of Phillipstown, if I'm looking at a site and, in this tool, it estimates, the rough megawatt size of a system that could fit on that site. Let's say that's like a 2 megawatt system. And then I'm looking at this hosting capacity, and it's showing that there's 0.5 megawatt of excess capacity. You know, I know it's all rough, but in your mind, are you then like, oh, you just got to assume there's that added cost, that there's going to be a major upgrade. You know, you've got a site that can do 2 megawatts, potentially, roughly, whatever, but it's the only wires close to it have like 1/4 of that capacity. Then you just know that.
Yes, but I would again, so first of all, I think we're going to see, and to some of the comments made a few minutes ago, we're going to see a lot of upgrades because we need them. And I think if the state wants to meet its climate goals, we're going to need transmission upgrades, we're going to need distribution upgrades. And so I think there's going to be more funding available from the state to do those, at least hopefully there will be. So, you know, if you want to build a system tomorrow, if you're looking to immediately contract a developer, then yeah, you may be looking at a lot more cost to upgrade the line yourself, or it may not work out. But if you're thinking about working on your town's zoning, then you're going to take these numbers with even more of a grain of salt, right? If it's perfect in every way, except for the hosting capacity today, or the hosting capacity is analyzed in 2020, right? You still want to make sure the zoning is solar friendly if that's a good place for it, and hope that the hosting capacity catches up.
Thank you. Now, you made that good point twice, that there's like the short term of getting a project developed like in the next year, and then the long-term zoning of setting up future development. Okay, thanks.
Right. Yeah, good question. Thanks.
So one of the things I want to point out is that as we're electrifying, right, we're moving from fossil fuel for heating and to electrification, right? Air source and ground source heat pumps. Air source being the ones that are most concerning, unfortunately, because when the peak demand in the wintertime increases, it's going to be 4 times what it is today in the wintertime when you mix the fossil fuel with electrification. So the data, based on the age of this data and the ability for us to get, when we do a C-serve for interconnection with a utility, they look at their current capacity hosting and their projected capacity at the time. And they're looking for us to fund the upgrade, right? That's the problem with this, with this. I mean, it's not a problem that we have, but a developer is going to look at this and they're going to say, what? New lines from the substation? Because there's really no planning, right, that's being done, right? It's just sort of like this, this kind of organized chaos. And even there's a lot of salt that you have to put on here. It's not a little bit of salt, right? We need to try to figure out, and maybe that's where we've got to resort to litigation in order to be able to succeed, although I hate to think that that's our only recourse. But go ahead, man. I see you're about ready to jump in on it.
Can I chime in on that too, Denise?
Go ahead, and I'll wrap it up. Go ahead, Andrew. I'll wrap it up.
Okay, just a quick piece I want to say. I really appreciate you bringing up the heating piece, because from my layperson's knowledge, the idea of using electricity to generate heat is a high order of energy being used to do a low order of work. And heating is actually a low order of work and can be done with much more appropriate technologies than electricity. And geothermal heat pumps and blown hot air and HVAC and everything being 100% electric is actually a misguided presupposition that it makes any reasonable design sense whatsoever.
I totally disagree, but that's okay.
No, that's okay. We can patently, because actually,
at some point, if you want to have this conversation.
No, it's not a conversation. It's a statement. And the statement is that heat is something that's a lot easier to generate with low orders of energy than electricity. And electricity is a very high order of energy. And it makes sense to create heat with things like anaerobic digestion and decomposition and other things that are actually passive technologies. solar makes a lot of sense to use for various things like lights and electronics and computers. There's a right technology for a right type of energy, and using electricity ubiquitously to do things that can actually be done better with biomass decomposition and low orders of energy supply makes better design sense than trying to retrofit a grid to use something like electricity to heat our homes.
It's not, okay, it just for your, just as a point of clarification, the idea of using electricity is not to generate heat, it's to move heat. And the efficiency of the ground source heat pumps, of being able to take heat that's already in the earth and put it into the house, is a lot cheaper and certainly less less of a problem than it is to burn any fossil fuel or anaerobic digestion for that matter.
220 well pumps are an energy hog by anybody's analysis. And when you're using a deep submersible pump to circulate water through a geothermal system, plus the cost of drilling the wells, you're not going to convince me that geothermal and HVAC make any good design sense.
Okay.
I'm going to ask that this is a side conversation.
Yes.
And if folks want to stay on after, I've just gone through that and I could share my experience. But what I really wanted to answer was the issue of interconnection and mention that, for example, in town of Kingston, the city of Kingston's old landfill at Jockey Hill, Central Hudson was going to charge the developer double the actual cost, which made interconnection really not feasible, and that project never got developed.
Sure.
I think what we need to do, and this is something the Energy Working Group is going to recommend, is a sharing so that some of the cost goes to the developer, some of the cost goes to the utility, and utility costs end up getting, they're guaranteed 9 to 10% return on investment. And that some of the costs be borne by the state to achieve the state's goals, but none of the costs be inflated. So that's a recommendation that we're making moving forward on this transformation of the grid. So I wanted to make that point. We can't do that all on this training session, but I wanted you guys to know that there are people working on it and trying to sort out a fair and equitable and efficient solution. And I'd be glad to stay on after if people want to talk about so-called beneficial electrification. But what's really important here is that we stay ahead of that curve. Otherwise, we will end up either burning more fossil fuel or keeping older fossil fuel plants that need to be shut down running longer. So that's why this is so important, is to get the renewables in place as quickly as we can. So Alex, what's next? Sorry.
Thanks. So just to reiterate, before we move on, this Learn to Interpret Hosting Capacity Maps info dive is where we break down and do worked examples of how to actually read these pop-ups, because there's a lot of numbers and it is complex. And I'll also point out this blue bar up here as your scroll indicator, so you know how far along in your info dive you are, since it does dump you back in where you left off usually. So that is our distribution lines. Hosting capacity is for distribution lines. Now we're going to go to transmission lines. That's the big guys. That's these the long distance, large scale, moving large amounts of electricity from large power plants across long distances. And so these are relevant to utility scale solar development. And when we say utility scale, it's usually 20 megawatts or above. So you're looking at something like 100 acres. These are the really, really large scale projects. We are seeing a few of these in the Hudson Valley. Many of them are going to be built upstate and in Western New York, and they're going to be trying to pipe down electricity towards New York City. But basically for a large scale, for utility scale solar project, the number that developers tend to throw out is something like $1 million per mile of new line. So if you're talking about large utility scale solar, it's probably going to be along these bright pink lines here. And you can click on these again and get a little bit of information about them. But these are going to be relevant only when your community has enough room to do these really large scale projects. And those are regulated by the state, not by local authority. So that is all of part 3. So up next we can do part 4. Any questions on transmission lines before I move on?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. I'm the planner in the town of Cortland, so I only am really dealing with this so far from a regulatory perspective. But we've had 4 to 5 megawatt solar applications to the town. 3 have progressed through the planning board, 2 have sort of been stopped. But in my world, it's the solar developer that is finding the place where they don't have to make any improvements to the distribution line. So I just thought that was the way it was everywhere. But from what I'm hearing now, that they're and it makes sense to me that they should be prepared to have to do upgrades and find these or locate these places, these facilities in other places.
Yeah, that's going to be sort of up to the town and the town's code, right? And so I don't know, Audrey, if you want to comment on that, but basically, we've heard some folks say it's kind of like the Wild West, and this tool is hopefully trying to get out in front of that sort of Wild West atmosphere and try to help steer developers to the places that are best for the towns and the developers, as opposed to just the developers.
Well, because you had said something very important. I had a simplistic view. It just seemed to me you start with the best place to locate on an interconnection purpose. But that's obviously what the solar developer is looking for. That shouldn't really be driving my thought process so much as a regulator.
Exactly. Yep. 100%. And so that's sort of why we flipped it on its head with the 4 steps of smart solar planning, so that this step is last.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll just point out a few other features of the tools before I click over into part 4. Lots of data sets here. If you want to learn more about that, each individual data set, there is a link to our data sources document. And that's in a few different places, but one of them is at the end of part 3. And then we also recommend that you have 2 tabs open, one for part 3 and one for part 4 when you go to part 4. So if folks are not sure on how to use tabs in their browsers, they can get a little help here. You can also go back to the solar mapping tool homepage if, for instance, you wanted to review part 1 or 2. That would be the way to do that. My email is here. If you have a question you can't figure out the answer to, please feel free to email me. So now we're going to click over to part 4. I think in most browsers, it should open in a new tab. So I have part 3 open and part 4 open. If it doesn't, you can right click and click open a new tab, or whatever the right click equivalent on a Mac is. So here's part 4. It's loading up. We have a disclaimer. And we also have another link to our data sources page, and we have a link to our tips and frequently asked questions. So I encourage you, especially if you're being frustrated by something, to check this out. It's organized by questions, and you can click on a question and it'll pop you down to the answer for that question. And the links are up here at the top. There's also return to list of questions links. So that, again, one link to the tips and frequently asked questions or the troubleshooting document is right here in the disclaimer. I'm going to click agree. To point out a few more features. So I'm not going to delve into things too deeply here, but I do want to point out sort of some of the bells and whistles so that folks can play if they want to between now and our next session. There's a little link or paperclippy looking thing here that has links to the solar mapping tool homepage, the How to Solar Now homepage. So that also includes our zoning guide and our siting guide. Again, links to the data layer sources and the tips and frequently asked questions. We have a ruler here. It's a little bit fiddly, but it does work pretty well. So you can outline an area or you can measure distances and you can change your units. That's particularly useful for areas if you want to do acres or square feet, for instance. We have a drawing tool. So if you wanted to outline a site, you could do that. I recommend you change your color to all the way transparent. And then you can set your outline color as you like. I'm just going to zoom in here. You can also make your drawing have a measurement. I would recommend against that because it can be a little bit annoying, but I can sort of click around now and outline a site, and that'll stay. I can close this. I can zoom in and out. My site is going to stay outlined, so that can be a nice tool to have. I click back into here, scroll down to the bottom, and click clear or undo to get rid of that. There's a print function. It's a bit clunky, and I apologize for that, but that's the best that we can do with the platform we're using. It's also kind of slow. We have a full screen option if you want to get rid of the stuff over here, which I wouldn't recommend at first, but later on you might want to do that. You can click into the full screen mode. Or you can also bring up a little overview map. So as I zoom around, this shows me, and this is useful if I'm really far zoomed in, I can see where in town I'm zoomed to. Now, there's lots of buttons here. Don't worry if you forget what they are. We have a link or a quick help for that, tools and functions. That'll bring up this diagram that shows you where all these things are. Down at the bottom here is our layer groups. So I've grouped the layers according to themes. If I hover over, I can see what those themes are. We have that here, and we also have a cheat sheet, each layer group. This is a quick help here. So we've got a cheat sheet for what they are. And so when the map comes up, it already has our solar opportunity layers turned on. If I expand these little drop downs, it's going to show me the key or the legend for what these things are. I can also look at a legend. And so if I turn on more than one layers in more than one group, they'll all be in the legend. If I want to turn off all of the layers in the group, there's this here, and I can do turn on all layers or turn off all layers in the group. Also collapse or expand them all. So expanding would be showing me the keys for all of them. Collapsing does the opposite. On a smaller screen, you won't see all of these icons. You use this arrow here and here to scroll through these boxes. The other thing I'll point out is our base maps. These can be super useful. Either the terrain map, this is sort of showing you the lay of the land and can help thinking about what's flat, what's south facing. If you zoom in too far, this doesn't work. You can then go to the topographic map if you're familiar with those. And I can teach folks who want to learn how to read those offline, but this also shows you sort of steep and flat areas. You can also use imagery or imagery with labels. The labels just, for instance, this Town of Ulster and Kingston label, that's part of the imagery with labels. So I can get that to go away if I don't want to, if I don't want it there. And imagery can be really useful for figuring out, for instance, where large parking lots are that correspond to rooftops. It defaults to streets, and of course this parking lot is shown, but these parking lots are not shown. I can go to imagery and I see, oh yes, there are actually big parking lots here. And oh look, here's landfill solar already built. This is, I think, the Ulster County landfill. And if I go to our opportunity layers and turn on our mine land, oh, it's not in the data set, interesting. Anyway, so those are a few of the bells and whistles. happy to take questions on that. But as I said, we have links to the other parts. If you scroll down, we have links to the worksheets. We have links to the troubleshooting document. And then we have some examples, turn on this layer and that layer and think about this, that sort of a thing. But I want to pause there. Any questions either from part 3 or sort of the nuts and bolts and features of part 4, so that you all can dig in over the next 2 weeks before we meet next and have a more interactive and discussion-based meeting.
I have a question.
Please.
So we're talking about the prospect of putting solar on rooftops of shopping malls and stuff like that. So how do you deal with that when, I guess in some of the previous, what you showed us previously, it said that you should have a minimum of, what was it, 3 megawatts for our facilities? Am I imagining that? So if you put them on a supermarket or a series of supermarkets or a shopping mall, you're not going to get a whole lot. I mean, I would love to see them there, but are these, how do you plan for that? How do you plan these facilities?
Yeah, there's no set limit per se.
No minimum, you mean?
No. Because we're focused on sort of the municipal planning aspect of it, we've highlighted the bigger rooftops, but it scales all the way down to houses and sheds and garages, right? And everything in between. There are different bins. So I'm actually going to go back to part 1, which is opening in a new tab again. Right, so there are these bins and some of these impact how the project is regulated and how it goes through the permitting and approval process, right? So if it's above 20 megawatts, it has to go through the state approval process. But there's no set minimum for a given building size or a given, quote unquote commercial solar, quote unquote community solar. Community solar is an ownership structure, but it can be any size.
I have a question too. Do you have any experience, as I mentioned, my 5 projects have all been, needless to say, right in the middle of wooded, steep slope, wetland areas. So that's my experience. That's what the solar developers, at least in Cortland, are looking for. We have approved a large shopping center and the shopping center developer put solar, but I'm wondering if people have experience of connecting a solar developer with a mall developer, and do they typically, I don't have any experience where they work together. If I were to recommend a solar developer to find a site, I think if I were to recommend him to the local mall, he or she may not be interested in that. That's just my preconceived notion. I don't know if anyone has any experience with that. It just seems like it adds a layer of complexity to the solar developer that he or she may not want, having to deal with a roof load, a shopping center developer, things like that.
Yeah, I almost want to table that because I think that's the type of question that could use, I think, discussion and input. I don't have a simple answer for you. I think that's a great question, and maybe other folks in the group here would want to chime in on that. I do want to make sure if folks have very specific questions about how to use the tools between now and our next session, and then maybe we can, bring that up again. I think that question, I think the question maybe Andrew was talking about of how do we motivate the rest of our community to get behind zoning and planning appropriately for solar, right? Those are, I think, more broad questions that can't be answered with the solar mapping tool, but are definitely worth discussing.
I want to add that there are solar developers that, for example, specialize in landfills. And if they know that a community is doing this mapping and is supporting, for example, solar development at a mall, they might be very willing. And I think one of the things that we could do to be helpful is New York State has a list of solar developers with contact information. And we can ask for experience with shopping malls and large industrial sites and see, so we can help provide that information. But I think the signal that comes from the municipality is going to be critical. And that's why I think this is such a valuable tool. But you're right, we want to stay focused on the layers and how we can put it all together.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that quickly, the carrot for the developer here is not getting bogged down in the review process and not getting bogged down in litigation and not having the town come out with pitchforks, right? If you showed a solar developer a map of your town and said, here are the places where if you cite solar, it's going to sail through the review process, then that could be a really big carrot for the developers.
That's exactly what I was thinking. That makes a ton of sense.
I have a question about grid capacity, about looking at grid capacity and rooftop solar. Basically, these rooftop solars are sort of roundup error when we do the math on capacity. Is that the correct way to look at it? Or could if there's enough of these rooftop solars in one area, could it overwhelm the capacity?
That's a great question. I think my guess would be, the answer is yes. If you get enough of them, it could overwhelm the hosting capacity. How much is enough? I don't know. And I also, that the speed of development versus the speed of upgrades is also going to come into play there. So
I would add it also has to do with what circuits the malls and the whatever you're looking at are on. You can have like the Poughkeepsie Galleria, for example, right by that mall. There's 4 circuits running over there that all go in different directions that have their own hosting capacities. Central Hudson, I looked at their hosting map outside of the whole the map tool, and they actually have the circuit numbers on their map that's external. If you wanted to look into how many shopping centers would be on one line, one feeder, one circuit, to give you more of a background for your question.
I'm also thinking about sort of government buildings, schools, town halls. A lot of them have flat roofs that could have some potential for solar. So it's not only shopping malls.
Aren't we almost concerned in the wrong direction? I mean, our concern would be that we're going to develop solar farms faster than rooftops. And then unless we increase the capacity, homeowners and shopping malls won't be able to, be able to get on the grid. But I didn't mention that because I'm just relying on what you said, Alex, which is the grid will expand.
It's going to have to. These are good questions. I just want to add quickly to Melissa's point. I've gone back to part 3 here, and I'm in our hosting capacity section down at the bottom here. There is a link to the hosting capacity page of the joint utilities. So this is the group where all the utilities get together in one room and figure out hosting capacity maps. And if you scroll down here, you can get through to, for instance, Central Hudson's map. So if there's, and some of the utilities map substations, some of them don't. It's on here somewhere. And the utilities are variously user-friendly or not user-friendly, depending on who's which. Central Hudson's pretty good. But to Melissa's point, there's sometimes more data in here. But again, here you can overlay hosting capacity with other layers, right? That's the value of this tool. But it's not to say that the utilities hosting capacity maps are not also useful.
Out in Town of Olive, originally a specific project was told that there wasn't hosting capacity, but Central Hudson went back and reviewed it and updated it. And in that particular project, there was. So, that's part of what we'll need to be doing is actually, having meetings with the utilities as we develop our knowledge, and they are actively figuring out how to upgrade both the distribution and the transmission system so that it can serve distributed energy that we're transitioning to. There's a
And I-
hand. Is that Carol? Or maybe not.
No, I think I was just gonna add here, the light bulb moment I've had tonight, which is really important for me, was Chris from, Chris Keogh's point from Cortland that, we're operating in an environment where developers are looking to develop in areas that, that will produce the most profit on the project and that are the easiest to develop. And so the fact is that what we're trying to do here with the longer term thinking is get ahead of that dynamic and create zoning and planning maps that has the incentive Alex talked about to say, you're not going to be developing in a wetland, and so your project, we're reducing the risk on your project. You're not going to get bogged down and denied eventually. You can come in and develop here in responsible places. And so my mind, I'm throwing this out there for a future conversation, not now, but, as we move beyond it, then it's like, what else can municipalities do to attract developers to the spots they want them? And, we're in the community choice aggregation now in the town of Phillipstown, and we're about to adopt we're working with Jewel to adopt the opt-out community solar program, where now developers can feed directly into the CCA and not have to do individual customer recruitment. So it's just like seeing the pieces come together of municipalities getting ahead and determining where it's going to be built, and then making development easier and more attractive in all sorts of ways. That's the light bulb moment. So I would thank you all.
Yes.
To chime in on that, I think it's also about, as you're saying, Jason, as we articulate what our vision is for our communities, we can direct where growth happens and what kind of growth happens. And I think that's key.
Yeah, thank you both. And thanks to Melissa. Behind the scenes, Melissa is taking notes on these things so that we can bring them up and have more in-depth discussions next time. So thanks, Melissa. But, when it comes to the How to Solar Now toolkit and this tool and the zoning and siting guides, I think to sum up our goal, Scenic Hudson's goal with these tools, it's getting proactive instead of reactive, right? And that's exactly what you're both talking about.
If I can, I think on a zoning level, you create floating districts. I think that would be a solution, is you work with your town board and planning board to create zoning floating districts where you want to see the solar.
I have one other suggestion in terms of building code, and that is moving forward, ensuring that malls and large industrial developments ensure that their flat rooftops can accommodate snow load plus solar. And that's very simple, but it addresses the issue moving forward. And also if there's going to be a roof replacement. We've had difficulty here in Ulster County. There have been a couple times when that could have and should have happened, but somebody did a feasibility study and said it would cost more. And so first of all, you can prevent that by building the structure in to begin with, and then think about the cost plus the savings and the environment. Well, I must say, I'm absolutely delighted how this is shaping up. It's, I think, exceeding our expectations, and I want to see if anybody has any closing words, because we're really, kind of right at the end of a full 2-hour session. So I want to be sure if something's on somebody's mind, they get to say it, and if not, make a note of it, and we'll get back to it next week.
I have a question again on the tool. do we have overlays associated with natural gas lines in towns? Because that's kind of, that would lead into the discussion I'll have with Andrew at some other point about district heating and cooling. It's the conversion of natural gas over to circulating water for, large loops. They do this on campuses. They're doing this in different places. I would, if someone wants to see kind of an advanced technology that's, a zero energy community of 7,000, there's a place called Whisper Valley in Austin, Texas, that basically created this concept of using, circulating water, and that's certainly less volatile than gas going through the lines. And, the utilities could actually create a revenue stream by adding these lines. So if we had an overlay that would show which communities, I know that there's moratoriums like in Westchester, there's no new natural gas lines allowed. One of the reasons for this to think about is that the community pays the leases for these lines, the main lines that run through the center of the, the streets and the villages. And they're typically a 60 to 80 year lease. So they're on the hook. Do we think that natural gas is going to be used for heating in the next, for the next foreseeable future? Probably not, but the communities would be on the hook to pay for that infrastructure if they were to continue to build it. So it's something to consider to add into the tool, I would think, as a possible overlay that would also be something that might be of interest to Kingston, New Paltz, anywhere where I don't know that New Paltz actually has natural gas, but wherever these natural gas lines go, you'd be able to look at planning for that and potentially talk about district heating and cooling.
And that would potentially prevent those from becoming stranded assets.
That's exactly right.
I am willing to, because of the Thanksgiving holiday, I don't want to try to do anything between now and December 2nd, but between December 2nd and December 16th, I'd be glad to host a side conversation on district heating and heating issues, especially since my boiler just went down and I had to make an informed decision. And, so if anybody's interested, I'll set up, we'll find a good time between December 2nd and December 16th, and we can have a side conversation. Carol, was that a last word?
No.
Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you all very much. Really enjoyed the conversation tonight, and exciting to be talking with folks about how do we direct what kind of growth happens in our area, and how do we bring a lot of thoughtfulness to what the future holds here as a community. So really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all.
And I want to really thank our colleagues at Scenic, Hudson, and Melissa for all the background work to make this happen. And I think we should all be proud of ourselves for paying attention, because this is what it's going to take to achieve the state's goals. So thank you. Happy holidays, everyone. And an acknowledgement to our First Nation folks at this time of year especially.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay.
See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, everybody. See you
Thank
next time.
you.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Oh, it's great.